Okay, thank you all so much for coming. So, if any of you go to the theatre in Dundee today, the chances are you'll see a fairly diverse cast performing on stage. And in recent years, we've had many examples of black actors treading the boards at the Rep. By far the most famous example, of course, is Ncuti Gatwa, the 15th Doctor, who began his career by joining the Rep's graduate programme when he was fresh out of the Royal Conservatoire in 2013, going on to perform in half a dozen productions here, including And Then There Were None, Victoria and the BFG. Of course, one of the main purposes of theatre is to reflect society back at us in a dramatic way. Hence, as our society becomes more diverse, so we would expect the theatre to do likewise. Things were very different 80 years ago. In 1947, the Rep announced its plan to stage a version of John Patrick's play The Hasty Heart, which was later to become a successful film starring Richard Todd, who coincidentally had been one of the founders of Dundee Rep in 1939. The play features an African character called Blossom, but the Rep struggled to find any black actor who was available to play the part, and they ended up having to delay the production until a suitable actor could be secured. Eventually, the Nigerian-born Glyn Lawson came up from London to take on the role. At that time, there simply weren't that many... I've upset somebody already. I'm so sorry. There simply weren't that many black actors available in the UK, and those that were here had to spend most of their careers in uncredited film and TV roles like spear-hurling natives in racist colonial dramas like the 1955 film Simba, which is exactly what Glyn Lawson went on to do. But tonight we're going to be taking this period as our end point, and going back about 100 years prior to this to look at live performances in Dundee from the 1840s up to the 1940s. This was a period which saw both a massive increase in theatre going, peaking in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but also an increasing fascination with popular American culture, which brought numerous African Americans to Britain, both to try their luck in music halls and variety theatres over here, but also to try to escape the worst of the racism that they experienced back home. Of course, racism was something that they could never fully escape, and I do have to give you a content warning that inevitably this talk will feature historical references, quotations and images that use particular racist terms and stereotypes that were commonplace at the time but would not be considered appropriate today. Obviously, no offence on my part is intended. Undoubtedly the most celebrated black actor of the 19th century was Ira Aldridge. Born in New York to free parents in 1807, he moved to England in 1824 in an attempt to escape racial discrimination. Although many London critics were still unwilling to accept a black actor, he gradually found success. In 1828, he was invited by the owner of Coventry Theatre to manage and run the business, becoming the first black man to take up such a position in Britain. At that time, of course, slavery had yet to be abolished in the British Empire, and Aldridge played an influential role in swaying public opinion. He became known for directly addressing his audiences about the injustices of slavery on the closing night of each play. In Coventry, he's credited with inspiring a local petition to Parliament for the abolition of slavery. By the time Aldridge visited Dundee in 1840, his performances were highly acclaimed, particularly his portrayal of Shakespeare's Othello, which also inspired numerous paintings, as you can see here. His first Dundee appearance was in the Thistle Hall in Union Street, and the Dundee Advertiser claimed, "We are glad to state that this meritorious actor has met with a hearty welcome in Dundee. His acquirements are of a high order. He is equally at home in the highest walks of tragedy and in the scarcely less difficult department of broad farce. It is rare indeed that an actor is found possessing such a combination of powers, and the interest is increased when it is considered that Mr. Aldridge is a native of Africa and has pursued his profession under great disadvantages." Well, of course, he wasn't a native of Africa, but it suited the publicists of the day to claim that he was, and Aldridge seems to have gone along with that. But we have a rare acknowledgement here of the kind of personal and institutional racism that Aldridge and others of African heritage faced. Although the review concludes, thanks to British liberality, he has now overcome the difficulties which beset him at the outset, and he is now reaping the fruits of a well-merited popularity. What the review fails to mention, frustratingly, is what play or plays Aldridge was actually performing on this occasion. But thankfully we have a clearer picture of his return visit to Dundee in 1848. This time to appear at the Theatre Royal in Castle Street. Here, his main performance was his most famous one, Othello, which the Arbroath Guide described as a perfect performance, such as we venture to say could not be surpassed. We've had the pleasure of seeing Kean, Young, Macready and other tragedians of celebrity in the past, but great as these were, on the whole, we prefer Aldridge's impersonation of the Moor to that of any actor we ever saw. Aldridge appeared for several nights at the Theatre Royal, and as was the fashion of the time, as well as Othello, he also played roles in several other plays. You can see a triple bill advertised here on his penultimate night. And he also portrayed two of his other most famous roles, Gambia in The Slave by Thomas Morton, and Mungo in The Padlock, a comic opera by Isaac Bickerstaff. The Courier noted, he played the facetious Mungo with all the richness and humour the part abounds with, convulsing the audience with laughter. On his final night, hundreds were apparently turned away, unable to get tickets for the packed theatre. A notable successor to Aldridge was Samuel Morgan Smith, another actor born in the US, in his case Philadelphia, in 1832, who came to Britain hoping to pursue a more successful career than he could have had back home. It seems likely that it was hearing of Aldridge's success that had inspired him to make the move, and he arrived in London in 1866. As it turned out, this was perfect timing, since Aldridge died the following year, and Smith was thus able to pursue his career without being in direct competition, despite taking on many of Aldridge's most famous roles. Smith toured widely right from the start, and first visited the Theatre Royal in Dundee in January 1867, presenting both Hamlet, described by the Courier as a carefully conceived and intelligently rendered performance, and Othello, hailed as an artistic and spirited personation. He also gave performances of The Merchant of Venice, Richard III, a short piece about the black composer, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, and new interpretations of two of Aldridge's best-known roles, Gambia and the Slave, which I've already mentioned, and Fabian in The Black Doctor, a translation by Aldridge himself of a French play by Auguste Anicet-Bourgeois. All of these were highly acclaimed and played to packed houses, which led to a quick return for Smith in December the same year, repeating many of his earlier successes, along with playing Mephistopheles in Faust and Marguerite, and giving a recital of Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade. Smith returned for a third time in 1869, this time with his new wife, Harriet Goldspring, who'd married him in Glasgow earlier that year, playing Desdemona to his Othello. Several of his other previous roles were repeated, along with a new play written specially for Smith, All But Lost, or The Totem of the Tortoise, in which he played a Mohican chief, an unusual example at the time of one ethnic minority depicting another. By this time, the enthusiasm of some of the local critics was starting to wane, the Courier claiming he wants fire and inclines to the melodramatic rather than to the classic in style. Smith made a fourth visit in 1871, this time to the Dundee Music Hall and Opera House on Shore Terrace, repeating many of his earlier triumphs. So I mentioned the Dundee Music Hall there. It's worth pausing at this point to remember just how many different types of live theatrical entertainment there were during this period. As well as the so-called legitimate theatres, there were also music hall and variety theatres, musical theatres, pantomimes, burlesque shows, fairground sideshows, carnivals and circuses. Each of these attracted a different class of audience, and were thus seen as more or less socially respectable. The early music halls were definitely among the least socially respectable, many starting as extensions to pubs, where audiences could sit and drink while watching live entertainment. This was a way of getting round the 1843 Theatres Act, which had banned the sale of alcohol in auditoriums. Music halls were therefore fairly rowdy places, with largely unstructured programmes, mostly singers and comedians. Towards the end of the 19th century, a desire to attract a more respectable class of audience had led to the evolution of variety theatres, much grander venues with a more structured programme of pre-advertised acts, which, as the name suggested, featured a much greater variety of performances. These might include singers, comedians, acrobats, animal acts, recitations, ballet performances, or boxing matches. And so the name Dundee Music Hall and Opera House was clearly an attempt to make the venue sound a lot more upmarket. And if you're interested in knowing more about the history of Dundee's music halls, I can recommend the excellent chapter by Billy Ruff in the Abertay Historical Society book, A Dundee Miscellany, on sale here. In fact, Billy is in the audience, so if you have any music hall questions, ask him at the end. At the higher end of this scale of respectability for live entertainment were the many public lectures given in church halls and other venues around Dundee. Unusually, one venue combined a church and a music hall, and also a waxworks display. That was the Bell Street United Presbyterian Church, which had a large basement hall that was home to Springthorpe's Music Hall and Waxworks. It was here in 1846 that one of the most famous anti-slavery campaigners, Frederick Douglass, gave one of his most celebrated speeches, commemorated by a BBC History plaque on the wall outside, unveiled as part of the Black and British TV series by David Onisoga. Born in 1818, Douglass had escaped slavery in Maryland at the age of 20 and went on to become a renowned orator and social reformer, and one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement in the US. In 1845, he published an autobiography detailing his experiences of enslavement, and it became a bestseller. However, his friends feared that the publicity might alert his former owner, who could have taken steps to capture Douglass and force him back into slavery. They suggested, therefore, that Douglass leave the country and embark on a lecture tour around Britain and Ireland. He arrived in Dundee in January 1846, staying at the Royal Hotel on Nethergate, and went on to give several lectures over the next few weeks, 4 in Schoolwine Chapel, 1 in Bell Street Chapel, and 1 in Tay Square Chapel. And his Bell Street one has actually since been reproduced in this book, Great Scottish Speeches. Such was Douglass's popularity that he returned in September and October that year to give further talks at Bell Street again and at St James's UP Church further along Bell Street. On a subsequent UK visit in 1860, Douglass again returned to Dundee, this time speaking in a much larger venue, the Corn Exchange Hall, which later became Kinnaird Hall. Of these many venues, the Bell Street Chapel is the only one that still survives. Douglass's popularity here was the catalyst for a whole series of abolitionist talks, many of them by formerly enslaved men or women. And I don't have time to go through all of these, but these are the ones I've been able to trace, as you can see, going right up to the end of the 19th century, long after the abolition of American slavery. But one name I do want to highlight here, and that's Henry Smith in 1855. And what's interesting about him is that he was actually a fake. As you can see from this lengthy list, there was a real demand to hear the testimonies of those who had endured slavery. And for many formerly enslaved people, lecture tours were a vital means of making a living. One of the other names here, Robert M. Johnson, is a good example. He was born into slavery in 1826, his mother having been brought to the US from Africa. He was enslaved for 24 years in Kentucky before escaping to Canada, where he became an anti-slavery activist. In 1857, he enrolled at Edinburgh University to study medicine and began to travel around Scotland and England to study give lectures about his experiences, not only to promote the abolitionist cause, but also as the best way of raising money to pay his tuition fees. Usually at these lectures, collections were held for the benefit of the speaker, and a good living could be made from the generosity of warm-hearted audiences. Henry Smith clearly thought so, and despite having been born a free man, he decided to invent a completely fictitious story of enslavement in order to get money from his audiences. Who exactly he was remains unknown, since he went by at least 7 other names: Charles Hill, Robert Nixon, Reuben Nixon, William Love, David Clary, Andrew Baker, and Hiram Swift. His fraudulent activities were first discovered in 1853, 2 years before his Dundee visit, when the secretary of the Anti-Slavery Society in London warned readers of the Anti-Slavery Advocate about a coloured man named Charles Hill who claimed to be collecting funds to redeem his wife from slavery. The following year he was arrested and tried in Brighton under the name Robert Nixon. He claimed to have arrived in Liverpool as a cook's mate on a ship called the Somers, but the port authorities listed no such arrival. He was sent to prison for 3 months with hard labour for obtaining money under false pretences. As soon as he was released, he started again under yet another name, and it was as Henry Smith that he came to Scotland and lectured in both Dundee and Dunfermline in 1855. His Dunfermline talk was reported in great detail in the Fife Herald, and was as much a pro-temperance lecture as it was anti-slavery, but still included entirely fictitious accounts of his own days as a slave. His skills as a speaker were highly praised, and he topped the evening off by ending with a song, which he'd apparently written himself. 2 days later, he repeated his performance in Dundee, with the provost chairing the meeting. A week later, however, he was exposed as a fraud on a return visit to Dunfermline and quickly fled the town. We next know of him in Southsea in 1856, where as David Clary, and together with a white wife, he decided to settle down and run a hairdresser's salon and toy shop. Once again, he used stories of his former enslavement to obtain donations of money and stock for the shop, but a few months later he absconded with the loot. Later that year, the couple turned up in Ireland, where he went by various names, including Reuben Nixon. The Waterford Mail warned readers about him, claiming that his wife was from Ireland and they'd worked as servants together, but he had found that slavery stories were more pleasant and profitable than an honest way of living. As William Love, he was back in Scotland in 1857, this time in Montrose. But he'd not been forgotten in nearby Dundee. After a very successful lecture at Free St John's Church in Montrose, he was quickly found out when a message was sent there by telegraph from Dundee relating his swindle there, which it now emerged had also included not paying his hotel bill on his departure. We know that he spent the winter of 1857 in a Sunderland prison, but what happened to him after that is currently unknown. It's all quite audacious stuff, and it's clear that even though the stories he told were fictional, he was evidently an engaging and entertaining speaker, and was thus arguably still deserving of at least some of the donations he received. Now, I mentioned the Bell Street UP Chapel, where Frederick Douglass and others performed, and whose large hall in the basement also doubled as Springthorpe's Music Hall. This is an original poster for the venue from the same time as Douglas's visit in 1846, and we can see that in between his scheduled speaking engagements, the music hall hosted a grand vocal and instrumental concert and Ethiopian entertainment, featuring the original Ethiopian troubadours performing popular Negro melodies. Just a few months later, the Thistle Hall in Union Street presented the original Ethiopian serenaders, fresh from an audience with Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Needless to say, neither of these groups came from Ethiopia, and nor were any of them actually black. Instead, these were white musicians blacking up. And this is one of the biggest challenges that we have in identifying black performers from this time. A look through the newspapers of the period at first suggests that they were a regular occurrence on the Dundee stage. Music halls frequently advertised so-called Negro or coloured comedians, singers and dancers. But the vast majority of these were actually white people performing in blackface. This notorious art form developed in New York in the 1830s as white performers used burnt cork or shoe polish to create exaggerated portrayals of black people as a way of demeaning and ridiculing them. As well as solo comedians or double acts, more elaborate group performances emerged known as minstrel shows, which appropriated African American music in a manner that proved enormously popular with white audiences in the US. The fashion quickly spread to the UK, becoming a regular feature of music hall programmes here in Dundee by the 1840s. Over the years, countless blackface and minstrel acts performed in Dundee. This is just a very brief selection, and you'll see they go well into the 20th century. Some of these were little known, but some were very famous across the UK, like E.W. Mackney. Most were British, but some of the most elaborate productions were visiting troupes from America, like Christie's minstrels, who were key players in establishing the minstrel show as a specific form of entertainment in its own right, rather than as part of a music hall programme. Some were regular favourites who returned year after year, including the Scottish comedian Will Candlish, who was known as the Black Emperor. He first came in 1890 and returned numerous times until 1907. Then there were obscure oddities, such as Harper and Standill in 1878, who were described as one-legged Negro singers, dancers and skaters. Goodness knows what that was like to witness. The repeated popularity of such acts led to some local imitations. From 1852 to 4, the Dundee amateur Ethiopian serenaders performed around the region to generally favourable reviews. The Montrose Standard described them in racially derogative terms as imitation darkies from Cooties Wild. Here they are raising money to help the widows and orphans of the Crimean War. They were followed by the Dundee Negro Serenaders in 1862 and the Brothers Smith from 1868 to 72. By the early 20th century, amateur blackface performances were far more widespread. For example, St Joseph's School put on a minstrel show in 1905. Now, it's tempting to imagine that most of those Dundonians who enjoyed blackface were simply unaware of the racist stereotypes being perpetuated. But it's worth noting that as far back as 1874, the Courier reported a complaint by the black population of Kansas City that Negro minstrel shows tend to degrade our race. So at least some in Dundee must have known how those being imitated really felt about it. Now, intriguingly, not every show of this kind was overtly racist. The English singer Henry Russell, who performed in Dundee in 1845, was the first British performer to build up a repertoire of Negro melodies for his act. But he did not perform in blackface, and he was an outspoken campaigner for the abolition of slavery. The Courier noted that the sympathy expressed with the degraded condition of that portion of our fellow beings must have found a response in many a breast. Now, such was the ubiquity of blackface that many genuine black performers also blacked up for minstrel shows in order to achieve success on stage. So in other words, they were pretending to be white people, pretending to be black people. Several appeared in Dundee over the years, notably the Bohey brothers from Canada, who came here a few times from 1883 to 92. Scott and Whaley, African-Americans who settled in England and who also visited here on various occasions between 1930 and 1922. And the Three Eddies, also from America, in 1931. One of the earliest examples, and perhaps the most unusual, was the astonishing but short-lived popularity of the African-American dancer known as Master Juba. Juba's real name is believed to be William Henry Lane, and he was born in Rhode Island in or around 1825. He started his careers in the saloons and dance halls of Manhattan, but his outstanding dancing talent soon led to him becoming a novelty act with the otherwise all-white blackface troupe, the Ethiopian Serenaders. He found particular fame in Britain after being praised by no less than Charles Dickens, who witnessed Juba's performance during his American travels in 1842. In 1848, Juba travelled to London with the Ethiopian Serenaders, and billed as Boz's Juba to emphasise the Dickensian connection. He became a sensation, quickly becoming a star attraction in his own right. In 1849, he came to Dundee to perform at the Theatre Royal, promoted by the Courier as the greatest novelty of the day, the world's wonder. The Arbroath Guide similarly hyped him up, hailing that ninth wonder of the world, the renowned Juba, the American dancer. From every quarter, Juba's fame is trumpeted, and we are told by those who have seen him that no such concentration of talent in his peculiar way ever before appeared on the boards of any theatre in Great Britain. And after seeing him perform, the Courier's critic claimed, "We feel that all we have heard and read about him is more than borne out." His unique performance style was completely unlike anything that had been seen in Britain before, and many critics struggled to find words to describe it. One referred to his dancing as a series of steps which altogether baffled description, from their number, oddity, and the rapidity with which they were executed. The term Juba dancing entered the popular lexicon of the day, and he's now recognised as having been one of the original pioneers of tap dancing, as well as jazz and step dancing. Sadly, Juba himself was unable to capitalise on his short-lived success, and in 1854 he died of fever in a workhouse in Liverpool. Another unique talent exploited by the music halls was Blind Tom, whose full name was Thomas Wiggins, previously Thomas Bethune, and before that Thomas Green. These various names reflected the fact that Tom was born into slavery in Georgia in 1849 and was given the surnames of his various owners. Tom was blind since birth and seems to have had some extreme form of neurodiversity. The Courier used the language of the time in describing him as being of almost imbecile mind, but it's now suggested that he was actually autistic. What was not in dispute was his phenomenal ability as a musician. He could hear any tune just once, no matter how complex, and immediately replicate it on the piano. He could play with his hands behind his back, and he could play two tunes at the same time with different hands while singing a third. Recognising Tom's talents from an early age, his owner at the time, General James Bethune, hired him out to a concert performer, Perry Oliver, when Tom was just 8 years old. Oliver billed him as Blind Tom and toured him extensively around the US, making him perform up to 4 times a day and earning up to $100,000 a year, an enormous sum for the time, making him apparently the most highly paid pianist of the 19th century. Except, of course, that all the money went to Oliver and Bethune and not to Tom, who at that time was still enslaved. Tom toured Britain while still in his teens, performing here at the Kinnaird Hall in Bank Street in 1866. This is in its later guise as the Kinnaird Cinema. The Courier's advertisement hailed him as the inexplicable phenomenon, while the advertiser, evidently more sceptical, sought out the opinion of a musical expert who claimed, "You never heard a better performer. Tom is as genuine an artist and possesses as much, and for as far as I can tell, a great deal more, musical talent or power as anyone else you ever listened to." Although by that time freed from slavery, Tom was still effectively owned by his white masters, who continued to exploit his talents for as long as possible through a gruelling touring schedule. His health began to deteriorate, and he died in 1908 at the age of 59 after experiencing a massive stroke. Now, so far we've looked at individual performances on stage, but black musical culture was also celebrated or parodied in more ambitious theatrical productions. The real catalyst for these was the huge success of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852. A literary sensation and the best-selling novel of the century, it inevitably led to numerous stage adaptations. With Stowe herself having visited Dundee in 1853 at the invitation of the Dundee Ladies Anti-Slavery Association, there was inevitably considerable interest in seeing her work brought to life on the stage. The first production to reach Dundee was at the Theatre Royal in 1862, and at least 14 other versions followed up to 1917. The earliest stagings seem to have had white casts in blackface, but in 1879 the Theatre Royal hosted a new musical version by American producers Jarron and Palmer, which boasted real Negroes, freed slaves, and the original African Jubilee singers. The latter performed African American spirituals as well as minstrel tunes. The show was a huge success. The Evening Telegraph noted, "We have never seen more hearty applause rendered to any performance in the Dundee Theatre." And every subsequent production to visit Dundee likewise featured a large black cast. While Jarron and Palmer's version still had a white actor in blackface playing the main character of Uncle Tom, later productions, mostly staged by producer Charles Harrington at Her Majesty's Theatre in Seagate, cast black or mixed-race actors in the lead role, including George Walmer in 1893, Ben Rowe in 1897, 99 and 1917, and J.H. Bum in 1910 and 11. Such was the success of these shows that they soon attracted imitators, the most popular of which was The Octoroon, an anti-slavery melodrama featuring a mixed-race romance by Irish author Dion Boucicault in 1859. It first came to Dundee's Theatre Royal in 1865, with at least 25 further productions appearing up to 1917. As with Uncle Tom's Cabin, many of the versions featured black actors and musicians, starting with Morgan Smith's production in 1869. And indeed some companies performed both Uncle Tom and The Octoroon together during a week's run. Shows like these helped to develop an enthusiasm for African American music among British audiences, leading to other talents from the US touring the UK. A notable early example was the Fisk Jubilee Singers, an a cappella choir formed in 1871 by formerly enslaved students at Fisk University in Nashville, which had been founded to educate freed slaves. They toured Britain and Europe to raise funds for the building of their new campus and performed spirituals at the Kinnaird Hall in 1873, having previously given a private recital at Weems Castle in Fife. The Courier noted the stark contrast to the blackface minstrel shows they were used to. There are no burnt cork faces, fantastic dresses, tambourines, bones or breakdowns. They are simply a band of plainly dressed ladies and gentlemen who know what Negro life really is because they are real Negroes and have experienced it, and who give us a true idea of Negro minstrelsy. Those who have not heard it can form no adequate realisation of the deep suffering and anguish of mind and body which can be expressed in music. So as we come into the 20th century, we enter the peak of popularity for variety theatres in Dundee, something reflected by the increasing range of black musical performers appearing here at this time. I've just put a few examples up here. I'm sure there are others that I haven't yet found. I don't have time to cover all these, but I do want to pick up on one name here, that of Gordon Stretton, who appeared at the King's Theatre in 1909. Stretton was born in Liverpool as William Masters in 1887 and began his career as a singer in the Jamaica Choral Union. But after the Great War, he found considerable success leading his own band and was one of the first in Britain to adopt jazz music. He would later produce his own pioneering all-black stage shows and performed at fashionable venues including Claridge's in London, the Ritz in Paris and the Hotel Savoy in Nice, before eventually settling in Argentina, becoming one of the most popular jazz musicians in South America. Stretton was one of a number of black performers who found success in the new theatrical form of revue, which grew in popularity in the 1910s. Rather than the disparate acts of music hall or variety programmes, revues were theme shows featuring a mix of song, dance and humour. It began to appear at the King's in Dundee in 1913, and an important early example was What Ho Ragtime the following year, described by the Evening Telegraph as a whirlwind of mirth. The new African-American musical form of ragtime had quickly taken off in Britain, And in 1912, the show Hello Ragtime had begun a record-breaking run at the London Hippodrome, where it was seen by over 1 million people. It eventually reached Dundee later in 1914, showing at Her Majesty's Theatre. What Ho Ragtime sought to capitalise on this earlier success. Both shows were based on white performers appropriating black musical styles, including derogatory blackface routines. But What Ho did feature African-American dancer Willie Robbins, lampooning the celebrated boxer Jack Johnson. 2 years later, Johnson brought his own revue to Dundee, a lavishly produced boxing-themed show called Seconds Out. This was the first time the city hosted a musical show with a black star. Johnson had turned to the stage after losing his world heavyweight title, producing and starring in Seconds Out, which had been a smash hit in London and on tour before arriving at the King's Theatre in 1916. The show also had a black composer, Joe Jordan, and conductor, W.H. Dorsey. Now, interestingly, this was not Johnson's first visit to Dundee. That was 5 years earlier, when he was still world heavyweight champion, the first black man to achieve that title, and one of the most famous African-Americans on the planet. But what brought him to the city in 1911 was not a boxing match or a stage show, but the chance to be initiated as an entered apprentice into the Forfar and Kincardine Freemasons' Lodge, number 225 in Meadow Street. Johnson's wife and father-in-law were very keen for him to join a Masonic order, but of course the racial laws in the US prevented any black man from doing so. He presumably approached various lodges in the UK, and number 225 was the one that gave a positive response. Although his arrival was not publicised, word quickly spread and large crowds gathered outside the lodge and the Royal Hotel where he was staying. Speaking in the Masonic Hall following the ceremony, Johnson claimed, "This is the most glorious time of my life. It has long been my great desire to be a Mason, and I have now accomplished the first stage of the journey. I will always have the greatest love for Dundee and Dundee Masons." But before even the initiation ceremony was completed, a telegram from the Provincial Grand Lodge of Forfarshire had been sent to the Right Worshipful Master of the Forfar and Kincardine Lodge, stating, "Stop Johnson's initiation." No further information was given, and the Master chose to ignore the request. He also ignored the complaints about the initiation made by two brethren present on the grounds of his colour. The incident sparked a racist panic among certain senior members of the lodge, and the next day an investigation began by the Provincial Grand Lodge into the proceedings, which was then passed up to the Grand Lodge of Scotland in Edinburgh. They seized on a number of technicalities which allowed them to declare that the ceremony was illegal and the initiation be declared as null and void. The investigation rumbled on for some months, concluding with the Grand Committee ruling that Johnson's membership fees be returned and his name struck from the records. The Right Worshipful Master, who had led the ceremony, was suspended for 2 years, and the past masters who supported Johnson's application were suspended for 1 year. Commenting on the affair, the Courier was in no doubt that had Johnson been white, his initiation would not have been questioned. But the Grand Lodge refused to admit that race had played any part in their decision. Thankfully, it did not prevent Johnson's return to the city in 1916 with the revue Seconds Out, which played to packed houses at the King's. The cast, as you can see, included his wife, Lucille, who was promoted as the originator of the tango, despite the dance becoming popular long before she was born. Ill health prevented Johnson from singing during the show as originally intended, but instead he gave a speech and then an exhibition of boxing, rounding off, according to the Courier, a happy jingle of music, dancing and humour. Just 4 months after Seconds Out, the Palace Playhouse on Nethergate hosted another landmark show, the all-black revue Coloured Society. Although it had a white producer, George Sachs, all of the talent on show was black, including Will Garland, Lewis Hardcastle and Hilda Dawson, accompanied by a chorus of 30 Creole beauties, as well as, according to press descriptions, 2 Maori musicians, Bill and Joe Cooney. Dundee seems to have been its first Scottish venue, and the show received a hearty welcome from large audiences. One of the show's stars, Will Garland, later took charge of the tour and would become undoubtedly the most significant figure in black British musical theatre in the first half of the 20th century. A singer, dancer, brass player, comedian, actor, writer and producer, Garland was born in Iowa in 1875 and came to the UK around 1904. Over the next 20 years, he toured 19 separate productions around the country and across Europe. He returned to Dundee in 1918 with a South American-themed revue called All Black, again at the Palace. As well as more Creole beauties, the show starred Garland himself, alongside Willie Robbins and Eddie Emerson. While previous shows to feature black talent usually imported them from the US, Garland found most of his talent in Britain, including the Birmingham-born Emerson. The Courier described it as a striking success and praised Garland's wonderful tenor voice and genial style. The 1920s saw the rapid growth of cinema as a competing attraction to live entertainment, leading many theatres and music halls to close or convert into picture houses. Dundee was no exception, but many cinemas continued to offer live performances before the film screenings, and in-person appearances by film stars were guaranteed to pull in the crowds. In March 1928, the Kinnaird Picture House, formerly the Kinnaird Hall, hosted a visit by African-American actor James B. Lowe, the eponymous star of Universal Pictures' new film version of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Although there to promote the film, the timing of his visit was somewhat premature, since the film itself wouldn't reach Dundee for another 8 months. Having appeared in only a handful of films before, mostly uncredited, it's unlikely that anyone in Dundee would have actually known who he was, but that didn't prevent the Evening Telegraph publishing an extended feature on him, revealing his love of Shakespeare and Burns, and concluding he has all the kindliness and quiet philosophy that one imagined Uncle Tom to have. As we move into the 1930s, black musical and comedy talent continued to appear in the city's remaining variety theatres, and I've put a few examples up here, many of them at the Broadway Theatre in Arthurson Terrace, but also the Alhambra in Belfield Street, what's now the Whitehall Theatre, and the Victoria Theatre in Victoria Road. But at the same time, the start of national radio broadcasting and improvements in sound recording for gramophone records led to a new craze for jazz and dance music. As theatres and music halls closed, dance halls opened. This in turn brought new black talent to Dundee. Perhaps the most notable example came in 1933 with a special appearance by jazz legend Louis Armstrong at the Palais in South Tay Street. James Duncan, the manager of the Palais, had discovered that Armstrong was appearing at the Empire Theatre in Edinburgh and quickly arranged for him to motor up to Dundee for a single show immediately after one of his performances, reputedly paying him £40 to do so. A few days beforehand, the Palais' resident band leader, Harry Smead, and pianist Billy Miller met Armstrong in Edinburgh to plan out the numbers. All went according to plan, and according to the Courier, a large gathering was given ample evidence of his amazing trumpet technique, with Smead's band accompanying him in many of his best-known hits, including Tiger Rag and St. Louis Blues. The Evening Telegraph claimed that Louis Armstrong, maestro of the trumpet, gave them notes so blue that they resounded off the roof like animated sapphires. Dundee's dance halls would later host other black talent, such as the wonderfully named Ken Snakehips Johnson, who came to the Palace Theatre in 1938 with his West Indian Orchestra, Britain's first all-black dance band. And 10 years later, a former member of Johnson's band, Bertie King, arrived in Dundee for what would become a period of 2.5 years as resident band leader at the Empress Ballroom near the Royal Arch at the waterfront. King was born in Panama in 1912 and raised in Jamaica. Moving to London in his early 20s, he joined Johnson's orchestra, playing clarinet and saxophone. He also gained experience playing sax with many other leading swing bands, including those of Harry Roy, Nat Ganella, Geraldo and Teddy Joyce, with whom he'd also visited Dundee in 1938. After serving in the Royal Navy during the war, he formed his own band and arrived in Dundee in 1948. Here he is featured in the telly with some of his band. His stay at the Empress was undoubtedly a success, helping to make it one of the most popular dance halls in the city. King later divided his time between the UK playing jazz and Jamaica playing calypso, and in the 1950s he led the Jamaican Broadcasting Corporation's in-house band. So I want to bring things to an end with undoubtedly the most famous of all black performers to visit Dundee in the early 20th century, singer and activist Paul Robeson. In the 1930s, Robeson was probably the most famous person of colour in the Western world. Born in New Jersey in 1898, Robeson won a scholarship to attend Rutgers College, becoming only the third African-American to study there. He excelled in both his studies and the college football team, and went on to graduate from Columbia Law School while also playing in the National Football League. Robeson gave up his law career after experiencing repeated instances of racial prejudice. By that time, he was already acting and singing on stage, and from the mid-1920s, this became his full-time career. He was widely praised for his starring role in a revival of Eugene O'Neill's play The Emperor Jones, and his performances of spirituals on stage, radio and gramophone records, often accompanied by Lawrence Brown on the piano, became hugely popular. Robeson had first come to Britain in 1922, and in 1928 became one of the stars of the London production of the musical Showboat. He lived in London for the next 4 years, and it was during this period that he first performed in Dundee, appearing at the Caird Hall on the 4th of March 1930 as the final attraction of a series of international celebrity concerts. This series attracted some really big names. As you can see from this announcement, Robeson was preceded in the 1930 lineup by no less than Rachmaninoff. Unsurprisingly, Robeson's concert was a massive hit. According to the Courier, the hall was packed to the doors. Robeson's magnetic personality seemed to captivate the audience even more than his singing, and he was rapturously encored at the end of every section of his programme. Accompanied by Lawrence Brown, Robeson sang a series of haunting Negro melodies with no suggestion of theatricality. He sang with perfect restraint and simplicity. Perhaps the most striking feature of this performance was its sincerity. Other singers there are, with voices more beautiful than Robeson's, who do not touch such responsive chords in the hearts of an audience. Robeson's success guaranteed a return visit, and he performed again with Lawrence Brown on the 29th of January 1934. This time, a photographer managed to capture him arriving at the station. Extra seats had to be added to the hall to meet the demand, with nearly 3,000 people in attendance. Again, the Courier raved. From the moment Paul Robeson appeared on the platform, he captivated his audience. His intensely shy but winning smile sets up at once a bond of sympathy between platform and auditorium. No one who hears him sing can fail to realise that he's an artist of great culture and fine discrimination. His sincerity, his deep-rooted interest in his race and sympathy with their sufferings, the essential manliness and spiritual quality of his emotions have established for him a secure place in the affections of the public. Robeson returned again to Dundee in March 1935. Here he is arriving at the station with his wife and Lawrence Brown. And this time the Courier managed to get an interview with him in the Bruce Hotel Carnoustie. Discussing his interest in folk music, Robeson dismissed the minstrel songs familiar to most white audiences, describing them as songs written in the Negro manner, in most cases written by white composers, and instead focused on true Negro folk songs, which he saw as close to other kinds of folk music, expressing the same emotions and feelings experienced by other races. Curiously, Hebridean folk music is not strange to me. I get every Hebridean record I can find, and in them I hear echoes of something that has been in my own life. By the late 1930s, Robeson had become increasingly politically active, visiting the Soviet Union, travelling to Spain to support the Republican cause in the Civil War, and becoming more vocal about civil rights and African independence. His agent was concerned about the effect this would have on his popular success, but Robeson stated, "The artist must take sides. He must elect to fight for freedom or slavery. I have made my choice. I had no alternative." On the 16th of January 1939, Robeson and Brown once again performed to a packed house at the Caird Hall. Multiple encores included a surprise rendition of Loch Lomond, for which the Courier's reviewer praised his successful pronunciation of Loch. And the programme went on so long that a special arrangement was made to hold the last Tay Ferry until the end of the concert. The Evening Telegraph claimed that the volume of applause swelled louder and louder as he sang song after song. Robeson was obviously moved by the reception, the like of which he said he had not received for many a long day. After a long gap, Robeson performed twice more in Dundee in 1958 and 1960. By that time, he had spent many years blacklisted in the US for communist sympathies and had his passport revoked. It was finally restored in 1958, and Dundee was one of the stops for his comeback tours. In 1961, his physical and mental health began to deteriorate, and he spent the rest of his life in seclusion, dying in 1976. So that brings us into the post-war era, when many other legendary talents would perform at the Caird Hall. So here's Duke Ellington in 1967, Shirley Bassey in 1972, and I particularly love this wonderful painting of Count Basie by the great Dundee painter Alberto Morocco. But anyway, all of that is a story for another time. So I just want to end by inviting you to explore the Woven Together Dundee website, where you'll find these and many other stories about the city's multicultural history. And that's the end. Thank you very much for listening.